All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Kathy Crum, and welcome to our webinar, Flight into Fantasy, a reader's advisory in fantasy fiction. I'm actually the cataloging supervisor for the State Library, and I usually present a lot of webinars on various cataloging topics. However, for today's webinar, I'm going to put on my fantasy fan persona instead. I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Valerie Edgeworth, who is part of our continuing education section. She's going to be chatting for us today, so if you have any issues with the computer software or the audio, just use the chat box on the right of your screen to let her know. And also you can use the chat box for any questions or comments that you have, and we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and comments. All right, so let's just get started. Today we're going to take a look at the characteristics and history of fantasy fiction, as well as some subgenres, genre blending, and also some resources. However, most importantly, I've got a list of lots of authors and works that I hope will help you with your reader's advisory. And I'll apologize now for any mispronunciations that might occur. It's really one thing to see these names and titles in print, but it's a very different thing to have to say them. And here we go. I think everyone should have, there was a PowerPoint of a handout, a PDF of a handout that came with your invitation, but you'll also have an opportunity to download that at the end. Okay, so we're going to start with what is fantasy. Fantasy fiction falls under speculative fiction, which is an umbrella term for genres such as science fiction, horror, and superhero fiction. Fantasy is often confused with science fiction, but it's really a different genre. Fantasy is a work of fiction that includes fantasy elements to make events happen that cannot realistically occur in the world as we know it. These fantasy elements might include magic or the supernatural or fantasy creatures such as dragons. And these elements are what sets fantasy apart from science fiction, which has science or quasi-science as the basis. I always think of it as fantasy has magic and dragons. Science fiction has aliens and ray guns, but that's not always the case. There can be lots of overlap between fantasy and horror, and some horror novels such as Stephen King's It have actually won fantasy awards. Horror fiction may contain elements of magic and the supernatural, but the focus is on creating terror. On the other hand, fantasy can have its moments of fear, scary creatures, and spine-tingling situations, but that's not the main focus of the story, just another element of it. Another genre that overlaps with fantasy is paranormal romance, which is a romance that might have fantasy, science fiction, horror, or supernatural elements as part of the story. Generally, if the romance is the focus of the plot, it goes in paranormal romance, which is usually shelved with the romance titles. There's lots of fantasy novels that have romance in them, but that generally is a subplot and not the focus. So they're usually shelved with fantasy. That's a fairly artificial divide, but for convenience sake, that's the distinction we're going to use for this webinar. Next, let's look at some of the characteristics of fantasy. Magic usually features prominently in the story. Even if the magic is not obvious, it's usually in the background of the plot somewhere. But sometimes this is not the case. For example, The Princess Bride is considered by most people to be fantasy, but there's no real magic involved. There's lots of other fantasy elements, but no magic. You've got beautiful princesses, you've got heroes, you've got giants, you've got ROUSs, rodents of unusual size, which I guess could be a magical creature. Maybe. I don't know. You could probably biogenetically grow them, make it science fiction, but that would be really weird. But anyway, so magic, just to say it, magic is usually a part of fantasy. Not always. Good versus evil is also an important characteristic of fantasy, and many times there is an imagery of light versus dark. In most fantasy novels, even dark fantasies, good and evil are clearly defined, with good usually prevailing over evil. Expectation of victory over the dark forces keeps readers following a fantasy series. Fantasy novels are rife with themes of transformation, young boys or girls coming of age, becoming a hero, or embracing their destiny. There's something just There's just something so appealing about and inspiring about watching someone as ordinary as the blacksmith's apprentice or the kitchen maid evolve into a hero and save the day. The characters of fantasy novels can include mythical creatures, knights, wizards, everyday people, and animals, and sometimes all at the same time. There's also a world-building aspect, which is another element of fantasy. Authors create detailed settings describing another world or sometimes our own world. These settings include physical depictions of the world, as well as cultural and societal aspects. These details are what brings the story to life and takes readers to another place. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the history of fantasy fiction. Fantasy fiction has its roots in the myths, legends, and fairy tales found in most cultures. The fantastical elements in myths and legends, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Beowulf and the Arthurian legends, as well as fairy tales like Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty, helped pave the way for fantasy novels. But real fantasy didn't start until probably the mid-19th century. Modern fantasy had its roots in the writings of some authors of the mid to late 19th century. Scottish author, poet, and minister George Mcdonald is considered a pioneer in fantasy literature. He wrote fantasies and fairy tales and is especially known for his novels Fantasies, which is thought to be the first fantasy novel for adults, and the children's fantasy, The Princess and the Goblin. He was a mentor of Lewis Carroll and also influenced C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Madeleine L'Engle, among others. Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland presented a world of nonsense that appealed to both children and adults alike. That was an early fantasy novel. And then also a bit more obscure is British author William Morris, who wrote several fantasy novels, with his masterpiece being The Well at the World's End, which was one of the first imaginary world fantasies, as opposed to a fantasy that's set in our world. Okay, so in the late 19th and early 20th century, fantasy fiction began to reach a larger audience as mainstream authors began writing fantasy. Writers such as H. Rider Haggard, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Edgar Rice Burroughs developed the Lost World genre that was extremely popular. This genre was characterized by explorers finding hidden civilizations, such as in Haggard's King Solomon's Mines, or tropical islands filled with dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures, as in Burroughs' The Land That Tom Forgot. Other examples of fantasy at this time were Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book and Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, published in the fantasy pulp magazines at the time. Also, during the early 20th century, a number of children's fantasy classics were published, such as The Wizard of Oz and Peter Pan. Due to these early successes in children's literature, most fantasy was thought of as juvenile, and authors who wanted to write fantasy had to write it as juvenile fiction. It really wasn't accepted to write for adults in fantasy. How things have changed. And that's because of J.R.R. Tolkien. The fantasy fiction that we have today was sparked by the publication of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit in 1937, and it was so popular that the publisher requested more stories, which led to the publication of The Lord of the Rings in 1954 and 1955, and a whole new world of fantasy was born. This explosion of fantasy in the late 1960s and early 70s introduced new writers, which included Andre Norton, Peter S. Beagle, Michael Moorcock, Catherine Kurtz, and Roger Zelazny. The late 1970s brought a new wave of fantasy bestsellers, including three key series: Terry Brooks' Shannara series, Stephen R. Donaldson's Thomas Covenant series, and Piers Anthony's Xanth series. In the late 1980s, a new breed of best-selling authors emerged, including Marion Zimmer Bradley, David Eddings, Raymond Feist, Margaret Weiss, and Tracy Hickman, R.A. Salvatore, and Terry Pratchett. The late 1990s saw a resurgence in children's fantasy with series such as Harry Potter. In the 21st century, there's a continuing expansion of children's and young adult fantasy. There's also a growing popularity of adult fantasy through exposure in other media, such as film and television. We have much to thank the Games of Thrones for. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about high and low fantasy. You may have heard these terms before and wondered, well, what's the difference? There's been lots of discussion, and people have different theories about what classifies for what. But the general description is that high fantasy is set in a fictional fantasy world that is considered a secondary world, and low fantasy is set in the primary real world, or our world. Stories that take place in a world within a world might also be considered high fantasy if that inner world is fictional or alternative. Examples of this would be the Harry Potter series, which does take place in the real world, but much of the books are spent in the fictional world of Hogwarts, so a lot of people classify it as high fantasy. Subgenres that typically fall under high fantasy are epic fantasy, heroic fantasy, and sword and sorcery. Urban fantasy is the most common subgenre that falls under low fantasy. However, a lot of juvenile fiction falls under low fantasy as well. Novels such as Tucket Everlasting and The Borrowers are examples of this, as the stories take place in the real or rational world with fantastical elements involved. Okay. Under the umbrella of general fantasy, there are several subgenres highlighting different themes of fantasy. Some books or series might have elements of multiple subgenres, and so might show up on a few different lists. And just a word of warning, everyone's definition of what these subgenres are may differ, and everyone has his or her own opinions about what titles fall under each theme. The definitions and descriptions that I give are pretty general and describe the most common examples, but sometimes we will just disagree, and that's okay. That's what makes everything fun, right? Yay! Okay, so we're going to start with epic fantasy, which is what most people associate with fantasy fiction. It is usually written in series and is heavily influenced by Tolkien. It usually takes place over a span of time and is set in a very detailed imaginary world, so it's high fantasy. It is epic in the structure of the characters, the themes, and the subplots. It deals with world matters and not just the individual story of the hero. It can be related to quest fantasy, as epic fantasy storylines may involve a quest. Okay, there are essentially three kinds of quest fantasy. You've got a quest to locate and rescue a person. So we're going to go on a quest to rescue the princess. Or it might be a quest to locate or retrieve an item. We're going to go and find the Holy Grail. Or the last type of quest, a journey to destroy an item. We have got to get rid of this ring. So those are your usual options for quest fantasy. In most quest fantasy novels, you never go questing alone. Quests usually involve a group of adventurers with distinctive talents. When used together, these talents enable the party to achieve its goals. And it gives the author a great chance to introduce a lot of diverse and usually quirky characters. Later novels in the quest fantasy series may have the same characters, but no quest. Okay, here are some examples of epic and quest fantasy. Obviously, we have Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Another example that, is so popular right now is George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series, also known as Game of Thrones. A few more classic examples of epic fantasy are Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, Terry Brooks' Shannara series, and Terry Goodkin's Sword of Truth series. I've added a couple of my personal favorites, which are David Eddings' Belgariad and Malorian series. There's also even more examples are Stephen Erickson's Malazan series, Robin Hobbs's Realms of the Elderling series, which includes multiple series written in the same world, and Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive series and Mistborn series. Epic fantasy can be a quick and easy answer for fantasy readers' advisory. These are usually long series or lengthy books in a series. So if a reader enjoys epic fantasy, you've got a nice list to give him or her. All right. Next we have sword and sorcery. This is the blood and guts of the fantasy world. which had its origins in the pulp fantasy magazines of the early 20th century, such as Weird Tales, Unknown, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. You have swashbuckling heroes and exciting and usually very violent conflicts. These are fast-paced, action-oriented novels. As opposed to epic fantasy, the focus is mainly on personal battles, not on dangerous world matters. Robert E. Howard is credited with creating the sword and sorcery subgenre through his Kull the Conqueror novels and Conan the Barbarian stories. His work influenced much of the fantasy that followed. Some other examples of sword and sorcery are the works of Fritz Leiber, Michael Moorcock's Elric series, and Fred Saberhagen's Book of Swords. The last example, Sword and Sorceress, is an anthology series that was edited by Marion Zimmer Bradley until her death, and it focused on female protagonists instead of the typical damsel in distress of earlier fiction. Okay, so now we've got some heroic fantasy. Some people use sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy interchangeably, and others consider them two separate but related subgenres. For those who consider them two separate subgenres, sword and sorcery is considered your pulpy category fantasy, just like you have your category romances, your harlequins and silhouettes and all that. Heroic fantasy has some of the same themes as sword and sorcery, but it's considered a more upscale version of sword and sorcery. Heroic fantasy is focused on the hero or champion in an imaginary land. Sometimes the protagonist is a reluctant hero who is thrust into a role that tests them. The hero may be of low station or of noble birth but not aware of it. The hero may have unknown magical abilities. Sometimes the story is focused on the hero coming of age and learning great fighting skills or transforming from an ordinary person into a great wizard. A new trend in the 21st century plays with the concepts of good and evil, heroes and villains, and has the anti-hero, or sometimes even characters one might consider villains, as the protagonists. Sometimes there is an overlap with epic fantasy, where the hero is faced with a world-changing task, but the story is still essentially about the hero's journey. All right, some examples of heroic fantasy would be works by David Gemmell and R.A. Salvatore. There's also Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicle series and Jessica Amanda Salmonson's Tomeo Gozen trilogy, which is a fantasy retelling of the life of female samurai Tomeo Gozen. Since a lot of children's fantasy deals with coming of age, I think a lot of children's high fantasy might fall into this category due to the focus on the hero's journey. Some examples of this would be Lloyd Alexander, especially works by Lloyd Alexander, especially his Chronicles of Prydain series, Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar series novels, and Tamara Pierce's Tortall novels. You might also include novels like Sarah J. Maas's Throne of Glass series in this category as an example of the anti-hero as the hero in heroic fantasy. It follows the life of a young assassin in service to a corrupt king. This series is actually in development for a possible TV series on Hulu, so just keep an eye on that. As I already mentioned, magic is an important element of fantasy novels, but in these books, the main focus is on magic. Magic is the basis for the plot, and without that magic, the story falls apart. Often these novels are set in our own world, such as in the case of the Harry Potter series, but sometimes the setting is in another world or another time, as in Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea novels. Some other examples of this subgenre are Patricia A. McKillop's Odd Magic, Aaron Morgenstern's Night Circus, Tanya Huff's Gale Women series, Deborah Harkness's All Souls trilogy, and Lev Grossman's The Magician series, which is also a series on the Sci-Fi Channel. Another popular subgenre of fantasy are fairy tales, myths, and legends. These stories were important in the development of fantasy fiction and still serve as important source materials for fantasy novels. Retellings of fables and fairy tales are widespread, and Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast are notable subjects. Notable authors for fairy tale retellings are Alex Flynn, Gail Carson Levin, Mercedes Lackey and Robin McKinley, but there are some newer authors and titles out there. You've got C.J. Redwine's The Shadow Queen, which is the first in her Ravenspire series, and Kat Hellison's Beastkeeper, which is a little kind of a flipped version of the Beauty and the Beast, because the main character, the heroine, is actually the one who's starting to turn into a beast, and so she has to break the curse on herself. So kind of neat flipped version of that. Cinderella is another popular topic for fairy tale fantasy, and here are just a few titles based on that story. While not actually based on a fairy tale, Gregory Maguire's Wicked series gains much of its source material from The Wizard of Oz. Mercedes Lackey's Black Swan is a retelling of Swan Lake. Alex Flynn's Towering is based on Rapunzel, and her Cloaked novel is a mashup of several fairy tale stories. Heather Dixon's Entwined is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. Marissa Meyer's Heartless is a prequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and she's also the author of the Lunar Chronicle series, which is a science fiction retelling of fairy tales. Sarah Cross's Killing Me Softly and Tear You Apart are modern-day reimaginings of the Grimm's version of fairy tales, which are set in a town filled with characters under fairy tale curses. So if you have any fans of Once Upon a Time out there, they might enjoy these novels. Killing Me Softly is loosely based on Sleeping Beauty, and Tear You Apart is loosely based on Snow White. Along with fairy tales, myths and legends are also popular source material for fantasy novels. Greek mythology is a hot subject for fantasy, with Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson novels, his Hero of Olympus series, which also focuses on Roman mythology, and now he started a new series based on Apollo. Riordan's Red Pyramid series is based on Egyptian mythology, while his Magnus Chase series is based on Norse mythology. You've also got Patricia A. McKillip's Riddlemaster trilogy, which includes themes from Celtic mythology. And Neil Gaiman's American Gods pulls elements from various mythologies around the world, and it's a brand new series on Stars. You also have a lot of fantasy novels that are based on the Arthurian legends, such as Stephen Lawhead's Pendragon cycle, Marion Zimmer Bradley's Avalon series, Diana Paxson's Hallowed Isles series, T.H. Watts' The Once and Future King, and Susan Cooper's Dark is Rising series. Magical creatures are important aspects in many fantasy novels, and the creature of choice is usually the dragon. I've included a list of several series that have dragons as prominent parts of the storylines. However, if you are looking for Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series, this is one of those times where we're going to have to agree to disagree. I consider that series actually science fiction, since the dragons were bioengineered by colonists from Earth. So I don't usually put that with fantasy. A lot of people just see dragons and they throw it in fantasy. So some other examples you have are Gordon R. Dixon's Dragon Knight series, Patricia C. Reedy's Enchanted Forest Chronicles, and this one's actually about a princess who saves the dragon. Mercedes Lackey's Dragon Jouster series, Cecilia Holland's Dragon Heart. I think she's actually known for historical fiction, so this is her stab at writing fantasy. Got a lot of good reviews. And then Robin Hobbs's Rain Wilds Chronicles, another good dragon ones. And now we have the fairies. Whether in the form of Tinkerbell or something a bit more adult and dark, the fairy, or the fae, is another popular creature in fantasy novels. Apparently, a lot of readers are intrigued by love and fairies, especially set in modern cities. So you see a lot of overlap between novels about fairies and urban fantasy, and also paranormal romance. You've got Neil Gaiman's Stardust, which takes place in the land of fairy, and also has a star as character. You've also got Elizabeth Bayer's Promethean Age series, Holly Black's Modern Fairy Tale series, Melissa Marr's Wicked Lovely series, and Julie Kagawa's Iron Fae series. And just an FYI, Julie Kagawa lives in Louisville. And a fairly new series is Sarah J. Maas's Court of Rose and Thorn series. Besides dragons and fairies, there are numerous other kinds of magical creatures. In Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar series, we are introduced to the horse-like companions. And in Peter S. Beagle's The Last Unicorn, well, it has a unicorn, as you might expect. Brian Jakes' Redwall series has a large cast of anthropomorphic animal characters, or animal characters who speak and act like humans, which include mice, ferrets, and badgers. And in order to prepare for this webinar, I practiced saying anthropomorphic animals 5 times very quickly. Gets everything warmed up, but very difficult to say. All right. Okay, another subgenre for fantasy is alternate history. An alternate history is an alternate version of our own world with a difference in history. Something magical or supernatural has changed history, and these books explore the questions of what if. There can also be crossover with steampunk or gaslamp fantasy, which we'll discuss in a little bit. A lot of your standard alternate history novels are usually classed as science fiction because it could have happened in the real world if the situation had been different. These examples fall firmly under fantasy because there's magic involved. You've got supernaturally gifted people in colonial America in Orson Scott Card's Tales of Alvin Maker, dragons in the time of Napoleon in Naomi Novik's Temporary series. You've got British warlocks and superpowered Nazis in Ian Turgellis' Milkweed series, and magicians in England during the Napoleonic Wars in Susan Clark's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Next, we've got parallel worlds, and a parallel world is a world that can be traveled to from our world. Sometimes that world is an alternate version of our own, and other times it's something completely different. One classic example of the parallel world is the Chronicles of Narnia, where children from our world find their way into the land of Narnia. Another favorite of mine is Terry Brooks' Landover series, where a man buys a magic kingdom from a Christmas catalog, and things aren't exactly what he expected. I read this book when I was in 5th grade, and that's how I started reading real fantasy novels, was this book right here. Pretty cool. You've also got other examples are Frank Bedore's Looking Glass Wars and Neil Gaiman's Coraline and Graveyard Book. Lisa Maxwell's Unhooked is a dark retelling of Peter Pan in which a teen is spirited away to a Neverland that's not quite like the one you know from Disney. In V.E. Schwab's Shades of Magic series, Kel is one of the last magicians able to travel between parallel universes that are connected by different versions of London. You've got the gray, which is our non-magical version, the red, the white, and the mysterious black, of which no one speaks. And lastly, there's Genevieve Cogman's Invisible Library series, which has librarian spies. I mean, we could just stop there, but these librarian spies actually travel to alternate realities, and there's magical creatures and secret society. It just sounds like a whole lot of fun. And now we're going to move on to urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is almost the exact opposite of epic or high fantasy. Urban fantasy takes place in a city. Although most urban fantasy is set in contemporary times, it can take place in historic or futuristic settings, in real or fictional places, but it must focus on a city for it to be urban. Urban fantasy focuses on the coexistence of humans and paranormal beings such as vampires, witches, and werewolves, and the inevitable conflicts that ensue. There's also a lot of overlap between urban fantasy, mystery fantasy, and paranormal romance. A long-running example of urban fantasy is Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, a series about the private eye Harry Dresden, who's also a wizard, and investigates a lot of supernatural disturbances. One prevalent trend is the strong female main character who's usually pretty good at kicking supernatural butt, as seen in Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake series, Patricia Briggs's Mercy Thompson series, Alona Andrews' Kate Daniels series, and Kim Harrison's Rachel Morgan series. In Anne Bishop's other series, Humans and Others, supernatural beings such as vampires or shapeshifters, have lived in an uneasy peace until something upsets the balance. If you're looking for a few young adult examples, there's Cassandra Clare's Mortal Instrument series and Daniel Jose Older's Shadow Shapers Cipher series. Fantasy steampunk is fantasy that's combined with steam-powered technology. It's usually set in a fantasy world, but can be set in an alternate version of the real world, which means there can be like some overlap between with the alternate history subgenre. The technology involved is very reminiscent of the technology found in Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. There's lots of gears and wires and gadgets, you know. Fantasy steampunk might also include fantastical monsters, legendary creatures, and supernatural elements. Related to steampunk is gaslamp fantasy, also known as gaslight fantasy or gaslight romance. This typically has a setting in Victorian or Edwardian times, and there's less emphasis on gadgets and technology. These are more historical fantasies that usually contain supernatural aspects. They may also include Victorian icons such as Jekyll and Hyde, Jack the Ripper, Dracula, and Sherlock Holmes. Examples of steampunk include Cassandra Clare's Infernal Instruments, which is a prequel to her Mortal Instruments series. Gail Carriger has several examples, such as her Parasol Protectorate and Custard Protocol series, and her young adult series, Finishing School. In Ian Tregillis's Alchemy War series, you've got mechanical beings and alchemy happening at the same time. In Emma Jane Halloway's Baskerville Affair series, Evelina, the niece of Sherlock Holmes, must hide her magical abilities in a world where mechanical power is the real power and magic is forbidden. You've also got Carrie Patel's Recoleta series, which has a gaslamp steampunk setting in a dystopian future. All right, next we're going to talk about just a little bit about time travel. There are two kinds of time travel: science fiction time travel and fantasy time travel. The difference between the two is the method of travel. If a person uses a device or some other technological or scientific method for time travel, it is science fiction. If a person steps through a magic portal or uses some magical object to travel in time, that's fantasy. Fantasy time travel is not a new concept. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is an early example of fantasy time travel, in that the main character is inexplicably sent back from the 19th century to the time of King Arthur. Although the main character relies on technology and scientific knowledge instead of magic, his method of travel is not based on science. Fantasy time travel is also a popular plot device in numerous romance novels. Example of fantasy time travel is Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series, which features love and time travel and is a TV series on Starz. Another example of fantasy time travel is Enchantment by Orson Scott Card. Then there's also Audrey Niffenegger's The Time Traveler's Wife. You've all got several examples in children's fantasy, such as the Magic Treehouse series books by Mary Pope Osborne. There's also John Stevens' Book of Beginnings series. A lot of good examples there. Okay, now for the lighter side of fantasy, we have humorous fantasy. These are titles filled with humor, puns, and sometimes a lot of sarcasm. They can also be vehicles for the author to speak about modern society and fantasy cliches. Mostly they're just a lot of fun. And here are just a few examples of humorous fantasy. You've got Terry Pratchett's enormous Discworld series, which probably has something for everyone. Piers Anthony's Xanth series, Robert Asprin's Myth Adventures, some of the works of Jasper Fforde and Christopher Moore, and that classic example of humorous fantasy, The Princess Bride by William Goldman. A few other titles in Aileen Martinez's Helen and Troy's Epic Road Quest. A Minotaur girl and a human boy are sent on a road quest across America. Some YA entries are Tina Connelly's Seriously Wicked series, which follows the adventures of Camilla, whose adopted mom wants Cam to be just like her. Unfortunately, Mom is an extremely wicked witch, so that causes some problems. Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows give us a comic alternate history version of the life of Lady Jane Grey in My Lady Jane. All right, next we're going to look at literary fantasy. And I use this term for stories that have elements of fantasy in the story, but that's really not the main emphasis. You might also see the term magical realism used to describe some of the novels on this list. In novels such as The Life of Pi and The Time Traveler's Wife, fantasy elements help to set up the plot, but the focus is on other aspects of the story. These stories are typically set in the real world, and the fantasy is in the background. Uh, these type of stories will appeal to readers who would not normally be interested in fantasy. Many of the works of Alice Hoffman and Sarah Addison Allen would fall under this subgenre. And here are also a few YA titles. You've got Anna Marie McLemore's The Weight of Feathers and When the Moon Was Ours, and Lara Ruby's Bone Gap. Stacey Lee's The Secret of a Heart Note is about a teen who uses her extra sensitive sense of smell to create elixirs to help others fall in love. Unfortunately, when she gives the elixir to the wrong woman, she's got to rely on the woman's son, who is a star soccer player, to undo the mess. You can just see how this is going to play out, right? All right, we're going to look at some genre blending. This is a major trend, genre blending or crossing over into other genres, mashups. Some of the most common cases of genre blending are between fantasy and mystery, romance, and horror. Fantasy mystery is a mystery with a fantasy setting or fantasy elements. There's a lot of overlap between fantasy mystery and urban and humorous fantasy, so several of these titles have shown up previously. You've got Jim Butcher's Dresden Files and Jasper Ford's Thursday Next and Nursery Crimes novels, which are some of my personal favorites. There's also Charlene Harris's Southern Vampire Mystery series, also known as True Blood, and her Midnight Texas series, which is soon to be a show on NBC. And then we have Alex Bledsoe's Eddie LaCrosse series, which is sort of a Sword and Sorcery meets the Private Detective series. Fantasy romance is a romance with elements of fantasy, which falls under paranormal romance. Most people use the term paranormal romance as an umbrella term for romances that contain fantasy, science fiction, or horror elements. Fantasy romance really isn't new, but it's still fairly popular, featuring love with vampires and werewolves thrown in. Some examples of fantasy romance are Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series, Christine Feehan's long-running Carpathian or Dark series, Sherilyn Kenyon's Dark Hunter series, and Karen Marie Moning's Fever series. You've also got Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake and Meredith Gentry series, which both kind of fall under fantasy romance and urban fantasy, depending on if they're concentrating on their love lives in certain books. But anyway, you've also got the young adult series Daughter of Smoke and Bones by Laini Taylor. This features love between a chimera reincarnated as a human and an angel, with our world caught in the middle. Dark fantasy. This is a blending of horror and fantasy. The purpose is to show that fantasy isn't just happy forest creatures or bright realms, and the concepts of good versus evil are very important. Heroes are anti-heroes pressed into service by forces beyond their control, or sometimes the story is told from a monster's point of view. These are fantasy works with a dark atmosphere or a sense of horror, and can describe fantasy works by authors usually known for horror fiction, such as Stephen King and his Dark Tower series, Ransom Riggs' Miss Peregrine series, and Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere and The Ocean at the End of the Lane might also be considered dark fantasy. In Rachel Vincent's Menagerie series, Delilah unwillingly becomes part of the attractions at a traveling carnival and struggles to find freedom for herself and the other attractions. In Levi Black's Mythos War series, Charlie is forced into service to an elder god of chaos to save her friend Daniel. Supposedly the god wants to save humanity, but is he actually more menace than savior? Well, we'll just have to read and find out. That one is still in process. She's still writing in that series. He's still writing in that series, so who knows when we'll see the answer. Next, we have expanded universes, also called extended universes. This term is used for novels or comics based on characters from a franchise in another medium, such as television, movies, and games. Expanded universe stories are usually new adventures for existing characters, which is different than novelizations of a television episode or a movie. These are considered further adventures and are not usually considered canon or part of the official storyline, but sometimes are. The Dragonlance series of novels is based on the role-playing game of the same name. Tracy Hickman developed the Dragonlance game and collaborated with Margaret Weiss on the first set of novels. And the Chronicles trilogy is the place to start for Dragonlance novels. The Forgotten Realms is another series based on a role-playing game. Ed Greenwood developed the game and also wrote a number of novels based on it. R.A. Salvatore also wrote novels based on Forgotten Realms and the heroic dark elf Drizzt Do'Urden. Novels based on the card game Magic: The Gathering and the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer are also good examples of expanded universe fiction. There's lots of graphic novel adaptations of fantasy novels out there, such as Jim Butcher's Dresden File novels and several novels by Stephen King, such as The Stand and his Dark Tower novels. There's also adaptations of Robert Jordan's long-running Wheel of Time series and George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series. There's also adaptations of young adult fantasy titles, and some examples are Frank Better's The Looking Glass Wars, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. You've got the Graveyard Book, several titles by Rick Riordan, and the House of Night series and Vampire Academy series. So there's lots of graphic novel adaptations out there, which is a great way of getting your reluctant readers in. Okay, well, we have finished the actual reader's advisory portion, so now I'm going to talk about some resources that you can use to find more fantasy fiction. There's obviously Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com. You can find a lot of stuff on there, and they usually have lists that will show you different sources for fantasy. Fantastic Fiction is a source for all kinds of fiction, but there are genre pages for fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal romance, and young adult fantasy. Locus is a possible resource for science fiction and fantasy, while Uchronia is a source for alternate history stories. A good place to look for more fantasy titles is to check out some of the major award winners. For fantasy, you have the World Fantasy Award, the Mythopoeic Awards, and the British Fantasy Awards. The Hugo and the Nebula Awards are for both science fiction and fantasy, so you just have to be careful when you're finding those titles. You might pick a science fiction, which is okay too. I like science fiction. All right, if you're looking for young adult or teen titles, here are some suggested sites provided by our young adult services consultant, Krista King Oaks. The Teen Librarian Toolbox and Voya magazines have some book lists. And the Young Adult Library Services Association, or YASA, has a top 10 teen list. That's kind of hard to say. This list is a mix of genres, so you'll need to kind of do some searching on the titles to find the fantasy ones. It's typically fantasy heavy. YASA also has a book finder feature, which allows you to browse by award winners, authors, and by genres. So there's just some good resources for teen and young adult books. This slide includes some of the resources that I found helpful while working on this webinar. Those resources with the check marks are available from the State Library's collection if you'd like to borrow them through ILL. It's the last three there. The audiobook Rings, Swords, and Monsters is part of the Modern Scholar series and includes lectures on the history of fantasy fiction and an overview of fantasy author and trends. The last resource, Genre Reflecting, is up to, I think, 7 editions now. And the older editions would be great resources for older titles. Okay. I will also admit that Wikipedia and novelists were very helpful in the creation of this webinar. And speaking of novelists, if you want even more titles and author, I recommend that you check out Novelist, which is part of the Kentucky Virtual Library databases. On the home page, they have a section on recommended reading lists, which are broken down by ages. This is an example of the fantasy reading list for adults, and it's a really great way to find some of the newer books being published in these genre, and they also include some of the older ones too. Goodreads. Goodreads is a great source. You can browse by genre, and fantasy is one of the genres that you can browse by. There's also lots of subgenre options under fantasy, and look, you can find books on unicorns. A whole bunch of books on just unicorns. That's awesome. How can we help you at KDLA? Well, we have quite a few book discussion kits that are based on fantasy novels, and with many of those being Text Express Youth Kits. Here are some of the titles that we have for our Text Express Youth Discussion Kits. Hopefully you recognize some of the titles from this morning's webinar, but we have many more available. We also have several on large print. These titles are more of the literary fantasy or magical realism titles, such as Alice Hoffman's The Red Garden, Audrey Niffenegger's The Time Traveler's Wife, and Sarah Addison Allen's The Girl Who Chased the Moon. But we have more. And we also have some regular print kits, such as Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, and Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. And for more information about KDLA book discussion kits, you can check out this link to our book kits page. There are lists of the kits for large print and regular print. We have kit lists, and these are broken down by genres. For the Text Express, unfortunately, they're not broken down by genres. The lists are broken down by the ages, but you can search in our catalog with Text Express or Youth Book Discussion Kit and Fantasy Fiction, and that will pull up a bunch of kits that have fantasy as their genre. Okay, we have come to the end of our Fantasy Reader's Advisory. If you have any questions or comments, we're going to hang out here for a while. You've been a very nice audience. We thank you. This is like my favorite thing to do. We hope you have enjoyed, and we hope it has been helpful. Right now, I am going to put up, hold on one second here. Okay. All right, we have a pod that popped up here, and you can download the files for the presentation. You should have received the handout in your email. So just click on, highlight the title, PDF Fantasy RA Presentation,